Clint Eastwood walked onto the Oscar stage, held the golden statuette, and said nothing. His eyes found a man in the back corner of the theater. A man no one else had noticed. And what happened next wasn't written in any acceptance speech. The Dolby Theatre. March 2005. The 77th Academy Awards. 3,000 people in formal attire. Cameras broadcasting to hundreds of millions worldwide. The envelope had been opened. The name had been called. Clint Eastwood for Best Director, $1 Million Baby. The applause was thunderous. Expected. Deserved. Eastwood rose from his seat in that characteristic way, no rushing, no visible emotion, just standing. He walked down the aisle at his own pace. Not slow. Not fast. The pace of a man who'd been here before and understood that urgency was a young man's affliction. He climbed the stairs to the stage. Accepted the statuette from the presenter. The weight of it familiar in his hands. He'd held one before, would hold others again. The microphone stood ready. The teleprompter glowed. 3,000 people waited for the speech. Clint Eastwood stood at that microphone for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stopped. His eyes moved across the audience. Past the front rows where the nominees sat. Past the middle section where the studio executives and producers watched. All the way to the back of the theater. To the standing area near the exit doors. To a figure most people hadn't registered as human, just part of the venue's architecture, like the lights or the curtains. An elderly man in a burgundy usher's uniform. Gray hair. Stooped shoulders. Holding a small flashlight. Standing at attention the way service staff do when they're trying to be invisible while doing their jobs. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The theater began to notice the silence. Presenters shifting backstage. Producers in the control room speaking urgently into headsets. The audience's applause fading into confused quiet. Eastwood hadn't moved. Hadn't spoken. Just stood there, Oscar in one hand, eyes locked on that distant figure. Then he did something no one had seen in 77 years of Academy Award ceremonies. He set the statuette down on the podium. Not dropped. Not tossed. Placed it carefully, deliberately. Then he turned away from the microphone and walked toward the stairs. Not back to his seat. Toward the back of the theater. The cameras struggled to follow. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how Oscar moments worked. But Clint Eastwood had never been concerned with how things were supposed to work. He walked up the center aisle. Past Meryl Streep. Past Martin Scorsese. Past rows of faces that had gone from applause to confusion to something approaching awe. His pace never changed. That same measured walk. The walk of a man who'd made a decision and saw no reason to explain it. He reached the back of the theater. The elderly usher saw him coming and started to step aside, to make himself even more invisible, to apologize for existing in the path of importance. Clint stopped directly in front of him. "What's your name?" Eastwood's voice was quiet. The microphones couldn't pick it up. But everyone in the back rows heard it. That distinctive gravelly tone. Not a question. A statement that deserved an answer. "Frank, sir." "Frank Morrison." The old man's voice shook. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "How long have you worked here, Frank?" 38 years, sir." "Since the theater opened?" "Different name back then, but same building." Clint nodded slowly. 38 years. That's longer than most of these people have been making movies." Frank didn't know what to say to that. Neither did the 3,000 people watching this interaction unfold. "You were here opening night?" Clint asked. "Yes, sir. November 1968. I was 23 years old. Wore the same uniform then. Different shoes." A small smile. Nervous. Uncertain why this was happening. Clint looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He'd written something on it. When? Before the ceremony? During? No one knew. He handed it to Frank. This is my agent's number. You call that number tomorrow. Tell them Clint said to take care of you. You understand? Frank stared at the paper like it might disintegrate. I don't. Mr. Eastwood, I'm just an usher. No, Clint said, his voice carrying that finality that made it impossible to argue. You're the man who's been here longer than anyone. Who knows every seat, every door, every crack in every wall. This building works because of people like you. Not because of people like me. The silence in the theater was complete. Absolute. The kind of silence that comes when 3,000 people simultaneously realize they're witnessing something that matters more than ceremony. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. To understand why Clint Eastwood did what he did that night, you need to understand what happened 40 years earlier. When he wasn't Clint Eastwood. When he was just another actor hoping someone would notice. 1965. A television western called Rawhide had been his break. Steady work. Decent pay. But he wanted more. He wanted films. He wanted to direct. He wanted control over the stories he told. He'd taken a role in Italy. A Sergio Leone western that American studios had rejected as too violent, too stylized, too foreign. A fistful of dollars. The pay was terrible. The conditions were worse. The crew spoke Italian. Clint spoke English. Communication happened through translators and hand gestures and the universal language of filmmaking, showing up, hitting marks, trusting the director. There was a man on that set. Carlo. An old grip. He'd been working Italian film sets since the silent era. Couldn't read. Could barely write. But he could move equipment, set lights, build scaffolding, fix anything that broke. He worked 18-hour days and never complained. One night, after a particularly brutal shoot in the Spanish desert, Clint found Carlo sitting alone outside the equipment truck. The old man was crying. Quiet tears. The kind men cry when they think no one's watching. Clint sat down beside him. Didn't ask what was wrong. Just sat there. Two men in the dark. Eventually Carlo spoke. Broken English. His daughter was sick. Hospital in Rome. He was sending every lira he made back home. It wasn't enough. The doctors needed payment before they'd do the surgery. Clint asked how much? Carlo told him. A number that meant nothing to a Hollywood actor but everything to an Italian grip. The next day, Clint went to the production office. Took an advance on his payment. Gave it to Carlo. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't ask for thanks. Just handed over an envelope and went back to work. Carlo's daughter got her surgery. She lived. 50 years later, she'd be a grandmother. She'd name one of her grandsons Clint. Clint Eastwood never saw Carlo again after that film wrapped. Never knew what happened to him. Never mentioned it in interviews. It was just what you did when someone needed help and you had the means to provide it. That philosophy shaped everything that came after. Every film he directed. Every actor he hired. Every crew member he worked with. Eastwood sets operated on a principle that Hollywood had largely forgotten. Everyone matters. The craft service guy matters. The PA matters. The driver matters. Not because of sentiment. Because it was true. When Clint won his first Oscar in 1993 for Unforgiven, he'd kept his speech to 47 seconds. Thanked his crew by name. Not the stars. The crew. The people who built the sets and mixed the sound and managed the budget. The people whose names scrolled too fast to read at the end of credits. Now, in 2005, standing in the back of the Dolby Theatre with an elderly usher named Frank Morrison, he was doing it again. Not with a speech. With presence. Away from the cameras, Clint made a choice no one expected. He stayed there. In the back of the theater. With Frank. While the ceremony tried to figure out what to do. The show must go on, that's the Hollywood rule. But the show's director was in the back of the theater, and he wasn't moving. A producer appeared. Headset on. Stressed. Mr. Eastwood, we need to continue. You can come back, finish your speech. I'm finished, Clint said, not looking at the producer. Still looking at Frank, who was clutching that piece of paper like a lifeline. But the speech, I said what I needed to say. Clint turned to the producer then. That look. The one that had stopped arguments on 50 film sets. You got enough footage. Use it. The producer retreated. What else could he do? This was Clint Eastwood. You didn't direct Clint Eastwood. Frank spoke then, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Eastwood, why did you? Because 38 years ago, I was nobody. And somebody helped me when they didn't have to. I've spent 40 years trying to pay that forward. Tonight seemed like a good night to continue. Clint reached out and shook Frank's hand. Firm grip. Eye contact. The handshake of equals. You call that number? He said again. Tomorrow. Then he walked back down the aisle to his seat. The Oscar statuette was still on the podium. A stagehand had to retrieve it and bring it to him. The ceremony continued. Billy Crystal made a joke about Eastwood's speeches being shorter than movie trailers. The audience laughed nervously, not quite sure if they were allowed to laugh at what they'd just witnessed. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, forever. Frank Morrison did call that number. The next day. Shaking hands. Sure it was a mistake. Sure someone would laugh at him. Instead, he was connected to Eastwood's production company. They asked him questions. What did he do at the theater? What did he want to do? Had he ever worked on films? Frank explained he'd been an usher because it was steady work. But before that, in his 20s, he tried to break into the film industry. Worked as a PA on a few low-budget productions. But there were no unions protecting people like him back then. No healthcare. No retirement. No security. So he'd taken the usher job because it had benefits. Because he had a wife and kids to support. He'd watched 40 years of movies from the back of theaters instead of making them. 2 weeks later, Frank Morrison was hired as a consultant on Clint Eastwood's next film. His job, watch the production. Tell them what a guy who'd spent 40 years watching movies from every angle would notice. What worked? What didn't? No film school degree required. Just eyes that had seen 10,000 films and understood story. Frank worked on 3 more Eastwood films before he retired at age 72. Not as an usher. As a credited member of the production team. The Oscar moment became legend. But not the way Hollywood usually makes legends. It wasn't a speech that went viral. It wasn't a quote on t-shirts. It was whispered about in crew parking lots. Mentioned in rap parties. The story older crew members told younger ones. That's Eastwood. He sees you. He remembers. Don't ever think your job doesn't matter on his set, because he'll prove you wrong. Clint never talked about it. When interviewers asked about that Oscar night, about why he'd walked away from the microphone, he'd shrug. Seemed like the right thing to do. The Oscar statuette sits in his office. Next to it, in a simple frame, is a photograph. Frank Morrison, on his last day working on an Eastwood film, shaking hands with the director. Both men smiling. Equals. On the back of the frame, in Clint's handwriting. Frank Morrison. 38 years at the Dolby. Then 6 years with us. Proves it's never too late. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. That Oscar ceremony taught Hollywood something it had forgotten. You don't measure a career in statuettes. You measure it in the people you lift up when no one's watching. In the quiet choices that don't make headlines. In the understanding that everyone, from the star to the person holding the flashlight in the back row, makes the work possible. Clint Eastwood has won multiple Oscars. Directed dozens of films. Built a legacy that will outlive him. But ask the crew members who've worked with him what they remember most, and they won't talk about the awards. They'll talk about the time he stopped everything to acknowledge someone no one else saw. Frank Morrison died in 2019, at age 74. His obituary mentioned his 6 years working in film. It was the thing his family said he was most proud of. Not because of the credits. Because someone had seen him when he was invisible. At Frank's funeral, a wreath arrived. No card. Just 4 words on the ribbon. You mattered. See? Clint Eastwood never attended. He doesn't do public grief. But everyone who knew the story understood what those flowers meant. Real power doesn't announce itself. It stands quietly in the back of the room. And it notices.